what's taking place in the academy in terms of the Iranian threat and Iranian genocidal and Iranian anti-Semitism, that also revisits what Charles said at the outset of this conference's meeting today. What I'm trying to understand is, why is there this disconnect? In Berlin, for example, the center invited Sabina Schiffer, who runs an institute to monitor media bias or media responsibility in Bayern, and she's an Arabist in that field, Middle Eastern studies. She recently supports the campaign against sanctions in Iran. She's a prominent supporter. I found this out through my reporting, and just recently wrote a letter to the editor of a newspaper in Bavaria that America's nuclear weapons program is more dangerous than the Iranian program. The Center in Berlin for Anti-Semitism Research invited her, published her works in their book, and is supporting this. What's happening
here? Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it is not astonishing if you go from dealing with anti-Semitism as prejudice or as racism. It's not far to go to those people like Sabina Schiffer or other guys in Germany. You can go in almost every political studies department, and you find those guys who have a kind of obsession with saying that North America and Israel and some other Western countries are even worse than Nazi Germany, or the same, or like South Africa, something like this. I think it's not by accident that they are doing what they are doing. I try to prove, for example, the Benz Center or Benz himself, they made several faults in downplaying anti-Semitism. For example, Bergman, he was saying, and that's relay, and this is typical because this is confirmed to Schiffer, I think. Bergman himself gave an interview to a Swiss daily, Neue Zürcher Zeitung, I think the 9th of February this year, which is one of the worst interviews I've ever read from a scholar dealing with anti-Semitism. What is he saying? He was saying, and the guy who was interviewing him was even more critical than he. And so he was saying, well, if a Muslim is attacking the Jews like they did in Berlin, as I mentioned in my lecture, there's something different if it's a right or left-wing German who has just a resentment against Jews and Israel. A Muslim is just scared about his or her relatives in Gaza. So if this 28-year-old Muslim woman born in Berlin, all her relatives, maybe besides a few living in Berlin, is saying Olmert is the son of a dog, this is, for Professor Bergman, a kind of expression of her fear of her relatives in Gaza. I mean, that's not really scholarly work. That's a kind of stupid thing to say. Because if she was scared, she can say, I'm scared. I can say, stop the war, whatever. But she's not saying stop the war. She's saying, like 10 other thousand people, and several times, and several cities in Germany, Duisburg and other Frankfurt, she's not saying this. She's saying, Olmert is the son of a dog, kill the Jews, kill Israel, out of here. So I think that's frightening. If a scholar who is a professor for decades on anti-Semitism is saying it is different if a left wing is saying this, kill the Jews, or a Muslim is saying the same thing in Berlin the same day, I mean, I can understand it. It's has nothing to do with scholarly research.
Thanks. So the question about the argument that anti-Semitism, the claim of anti-Semitism is sometimes used as a smokescreen to defend against criticism of Israel. And then Butler in particular. So some examples of the smokescreen argument. In the boycott, divestment, sanctions events a few weeks ago, I can't tell you how many times this argument was repeated. We're so sick of hearing of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, and it's just a way for Israel to continue its ethnic cleansing program. Zionism is, in its essence, an ethnic cleansing program, and that anti-Semitism has been used from the beginning to justify Zionism. These kinds of things. Butler herself, in the piece that I'm quoting, she's engaged in an argument with Lawrence Sumner, who just got appointed some major government positions, but was president of Harvard at the time. And for saying, in fact, almost the entire essay is in some sense a response to a statement that Sumner made, which was, he was worried about criticism of Israel being anti-Semitic in effect, if not intent, which is a cumulative effect argument, the kind of thing that I was talking about in my paper. And she says, Sumner, what you've done is you've chilled academic discourse. You've made it feel like we don't have freedom to speak about anti-Semitism, and we can't criticize Israel. So that's a kind of enormous smokescreen that she's suggesting over all of academia that people like Sumner would produce by making some statements. So that's the kind of argument I'm talking about, and that's part of what I meant to criticize when I was criticizing Butler. That argument has become so common, so often repeated, that I think it's hard to even consider anti-Semitism.
No, just that it's very common with this political discourse to use historical arguments to argue some distortion of them, to argue something. So, for example, even with the Holocaust, there is a lot of these arguments that the Europe of conspiracy, that the European, that in fact the reason of the state of Israel it is because it is not a reason to be settled there, because the Europeans are guilty for the Holocaust, and these have to be used as this kind of historical arguments to use Holocaust or not as an ethical issue or problematic or an historical view, but you are using to attend some political goal, and this is very common.
Also, I think for Larry Summers, just as a footnote to this, I think he spoke in 2005, and he was one of the few leading academics to stand up and speak out against anti-Semitism and Israel bashing in a very powerful way. And I think it was a very important moment in the American political landscape when it came to confronting anti-Semitism. And many people at Harvard claim, and I think there's a lot of truth in it, that he actually lost his job in part because once he started to speak out against anti-Semitism, the witch hunt began, and there was this issue, this statement on women and this sort of thing. I think it was a pretext to get rid of him, but the campaign started when he started to speak out against anti-Semitism.
Can I say something to CCA? Just a few.
Okay, we have a bunch of quickly.
No, because I was starting with 68, and it's maybe a total different discourse in Eastern Europe than in Western Europe, because even for myself, I mean, 68 is a kind of initial event for Western academia. Without 1968, we would not be here actually, 400%, because there would not be an institution dealing with anti-Semitism critical. Because until 1968, anti-Semitism was something, I mean, the people loved anti-Semitism, very in favor of anti-Semitism, yeah. The old school Nazi anti-Semitism all over Europe, especially Germany. So, and in the United States, it was not that much better. And if you look at Temple Marcuse and all those guys, the Civil Rights Movement, 1964 and also on, I mean, it was very important, it was the most important decade in the Western world, I think, until the year 2000. So the changes of 1968, which is actually beginning much before 1968, but it's a symbol 68, it was 65, 66, 67, Bob Dylan, all those guys, I mean, that is for every kind of fighting against bigotry and free speech. And you mentioned everyone is equal. Indeed, I mean, that's a point which I think we cannot go backwards. And I know, and that's a kind of contradiction, and that would be, maybe you know the book, The Dialectics of 1968. It hasn't been written, but it has to be written maybe by someone, sometime, because the Dialectics of 68 is, of course, there have been a lot of left-wing people becoming anti-Semitic, even anti-Western, at that time and later on, but it was not a starting point. Starting point was something different. It was a kind of against the old typical school of seeing university as, well, we have professors, they are on the highest level, then you have co-workers, and you have students maybe, and you have people who clean the toilets, and so this actually changed, at least to a specific PowerPoint. And so I think you cannot say 68 is radicalization and it's bad and it's ugly.
I said that there is a climate, and we have to fully understand this climate and to make the approach. Of course, there are. I said that also in that it is entailed some radicalization,
No,
It
not.
was a
very
revolution.
radical. It was very, of course,
Yes,
it was
and it was,
radical.
yeah, but this you have to see from all the faces.
Okay, so I'm going to interrupt. There's a bunch of questions and we're running out of time. So Ben and then Neil, could you ask the questions together?
Never mind, I'm unfair. You can skip me because I would got the answer from.
Oh, yeah,
the phone
okay,
now.
sure, okay. So Neil?
My question is for Josh. I appreciate the report of how things look from the human rights front. And I'm kind of seeing you as somebody who kind of feels caught between these two worlds. On the one hand, you see these human rights organizations that you feel a part of, but on the other hand, you also see more anti-Semitism than they see. And what I'm interested in mainly is your assessment of the prognosis for change in that community. And that would seem to me to depend partly on where it's coming from. Is it too much zealousness on the part of people like us when we charge anti-Semitism? Is there something fundamentally flawed in their worldview? Has it been hijacked by people who don't really care about human rights who are in those organizations? Is it just a blind spot about Israel? What is it, and what's the prognosis?
That's a really good question, and your observation about me feeling a little bit trapped there is apt. The prognosis is difficult to assess. I mean, the human rights community is very large by now, and there are some organizations that are extremely biased, and there are other organizations, some very influential organizations that have a lot of reasonable and smart people who I think could be susceptible to thinking about this issue differently. Now, not that many of them are yet. I do believe there's some potential for thinking about it differently. Again, it depends what you're talking about. So if you look at the UN is a large and it's not a monolithic organization. And while the criticism of Israel is overwhelming, there are some agencies in the UN that are more reasonable, who recognize the hypocrisy of what's going on. It's not the majority, but there are some. It's not, or maybe I should say some individuals in some agencies, and particularly the individuals that are made up, the agencies that are made up of individual experts as opposed to member state. That's not a great answer to your question, but I think there's some possibility, some reason for hope, but it remains to be seen.
I have a couple of questions for a couple of people, but I'll keep it very short. So for Kuzmina, I just was wondering, you talked about the rise in anti-Semitic incidents, how these organizations account them, define them, if you know.
Maybe you
Yeah, I will, sorry. My other question, I guess, continues Neil's, and we'll go, I guess, to Josh and to Clemens. There may be this idea of that Yossi Klein and we talked about yesterday, of normalizing Israel, sort of making it, and normalizing Jews, right, through Israel, and sort of thinking about Jews would also benefit strategically from actually trying to make anti-Semitism understood as one of race, sort of under the umbrella, back into the umbrella of racism in a way. You know what I mean? Sure, as a historian, I want to talk about the specificity of the phenomenon and where it's coming from. But as strategically as thinking about how can we fight anti-Semitism, perhaps if people think, well, anti-Semitism is a kind of racism, and therefore it's not okay for us to engage in this, maybe this would be helpful, and maybe actually collaborating, cooperating, and thinking about it in a wider umbrella is useful. I don't know what you think, to change this situation in human rights organizations and academia.
So clip one more question.
Me?
Jim?
It was more a comment. Well, it was a comment on actually Neil's question to about human rights and the question whether what the problem is to not see anti-Semitism as a human rights issue. I was just thinking that the problem starts if you don't. No, that's just like it's a long comment.
Is there anybody else have any question? Okay, so.
About this, how they're going to defend, there are still discussions about how we can get over this right of free speech. But because everything is under this anti-Israel and which is a legitimate position, you cannot do more. You can do nothing. And on this, everyone agreed. I mean, I have to accept even if not everyone agreed. And otherwise, the only effective measurements which are taking, there are to make, to educate Jewish population to report this event. And it is present that it is, of course, because it is something of violence, it is underrepresented through this monitoring. Always it is like this when it comes to violence. And just to make the people, to make Jewish people aware to report, and of course everyone to report. But for Jewish students there is this. So because of this, I said that it is a pitfall here because it makes it more specific Jewish concern. And if it comes only to monitoring and to audit this or to assess these problems, you can restrain very easy to the Jewish concern, and no one is educated to take action. It seems to me that because of this constructing this way.
So to Anand's question about whether linking with the fight against racism, or at least the language of thinking of fighting against racism, it reminded me of the part of Neil's question that I didn't answer, which was maybe it's the language, how claims making about anti-Semitism is expressed, kind of language. I think, yeah, when you're talking about reaching human rights advocates or any other particular community, the way the language is expressed, or the way the claims are expressed, makes a big difference. And that's not to say I know exactly the answer of how to do it. But I was thinking today about why is it that, for example, fighting for Tibetan rights can be seen as not inherently biased. Anyone can fight for Tibetan rights. There's no political bias in doing that. You're just, fighting for human rights. It's a good cause. But fighting for Jewish rights, sort of like Ben's comment earlier, that the idea of studying anti-Semitism, the way that's perceived is sort of parallel to the idea of fighting for Jewish rights. Somehow that's inherently biased. And not for everyone, obviously, not for everyone in this room, we hope.
That there is no image of Tibetans as a conspiracy or whatever powerful.
Well,
Sure.
that we know.
Well, you'll
that
ask
we
him,
know.
I wasn't asking like I didn't.
China, you know.
Yeah,
okay.
the Chinese probably will see it as
No.
I meant it as a rhetorical question. Thank you. Not a real question.
Like I live in the West. No.
Mr. Henny, the last word of the conference.
I mean, strategically dealing with anti-Semitism as racism, just to say to those people who usually just deal with racism, that they say, well, we also would like to deal with racism, can you improve us, please? I mean, the attempt of scholars, of activists, of politicians, diplomats the last decades, I mean, it was exactly that way. I mean, if you look at every declaration of Jewish community in Europe, in Germany, in the US, including the ADL, the American Jews, they always say we are fighting, they do in fact. If you look at the 60s and 50s, they have been fighting against racism. Means they say we fight for the rights of black people to be as equal as any other one. And now what are black people doing today? Are they supporting Jews as the Jews did support the blacks in the 60s? They are not.
Not the same.
That's the point.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, on that note, we have to end now. So everybody, thank you very much, and I hope we'll have a follow-up discussion about what to do with the papers, and I hope we'll publish some stuff with it. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lauren. And if anybody wants to go to the pub.